Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Last Week in AI, where you can hear us chat about what's going on with AI, and as usual in this episode we will summarize and discuss some of last week's most interesting AI news, and you can also check out our Last Week in AI newsletter at lastweekin.ai for the stuff we did not cover in this episode. I'm one of your hosts, Andrey Kurenkov. My background is that I studied AI at Stanford, and I now work at a generative AI startup that we'll actually chat about a little bit this week.
Ooh, okay. Hold on. News story? Are we talking
news story? Yeah.
She. All right, this is going to be a good week. I'm excited to hear about that. I'm Jeremy, obviously the other co-host here. I am the co-founder of Gladstone AI, which is an AI national security company. I'm really keen to dive into this one. We did not do an episode last week, and so we have 2 weeks worth of stuff to catch up on, and it's been an insane 2 weeks, so it's like unusually dense.
Yeah, I was gonna joke that we got lucky last week and nothing major happened, but that is, of course, not true. So apologies, listeners, that we did skip it. You know, life happens, but we are back and we will continue to try to keep this weekly. And real quick, before we do dive into the news, as usual, I want to give a shout out to some comments and reviews. We had some really nice comments, more and more coming in on YouTube that give us some nice notes of having a chill outro. It's fun to see that some people are listening to the outro AI song. A couple reviews on Apple Podcasts, one of them saying great weekly review show. A couple saying that we need less AI doomer talk and being a little, let's say, critical on Jeremy. And we do appreciate the feedback, and we, I guess, will try to keep discussing safety and alignment, but maybe keep the hypothetical X risk doom talk in its own sort of section and more topic-specific episodes, unless it comes up and will be relevant to a news story, as it will pretty soon in this episode.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also, it is tough because it's in the zeitgeist, obviously. So it's sort of hard to talk about frontier AI without talking about, the catastrophic risk piece, because that seems to be the consensus view among the top labs. But obviously, we have a section for AI policy and safety. We'll make sure that we focus the discussion there. Sometimes I think what's been happening too is we've had a lot of big models, and sometimes when the big models get released, like GPT-4o, it's always hard to know which section to put them in as a result. But very much appreciate that. That's great feedback. We want to make sure that we're tracking what people are interested in hearing about the most. So I do appreciate that.
That's right. And now moving on to tools and apps, starting with our first story. And it is, of course, this time from last week. The big news story that happened was Apple's announcement of its AI stuff that has been long awaited. So we now have the name for it that I think we knew, kind of a preview that we covered a couple of weeks back, Apple Intelligence. And at this event they held, they sort of rolled out a whole bunch of stuff. So there's many features that are powered by AI coming to the iPhone and Mac. Just to give you a quick kind of high-level view, Apple's entire approach to AI is very feature-first as opposed to, let's say, model-first. So unlike something like Google or Meta that have pushed out entire chatbots as an important part of their tooling, Apple announced many sort of smaller things throughout the ecosystem. So for instance, when you compose something, there's going to be a built-in kind of tooling layer in the OS where it can do kind of standard chatbot stuff of summarizing some text or analyzing the tone, things like that. Apparently, Siri is going to get a big upgrade, which I guess we all expected. One of the interesting things there is on-screen awareness, meaning that Siri will understand the context of the apps you're using, and you'll be able to type to Siri and ask it to basically do stuff for you. So that's just a couple of things. There are many other things like a fancy calculator they showcased. And the other thing to mention is there was a big focus on privacy. So a lot of it was going to how it'll be on device, running some of the small models that Apple has gone into training, or it'll be in this new private cloud setup. So very much in keeping with Apple's philosophies.
Yeah, and that whole cloud setup, I think, is really the story behind the story in a certain sense, right? The hard thing for Apple, like all these companies, to accommodate that greater scale it's going to be needed is building out all the hardware infrastructure, all the cloud infrastructure that they need to be competitive. And so one of the things that we've learned fairly recently is Apple has actually ramped up in a very significant way behind the scenes their M2 Ultra SKUs, basically their like kind of latest chip that they're building themselves. It's actually a fusion of two chips together using something called Ultra Fusion that Apple's set up. It's not unlike, we talked about this before, but NVIDIA's Blackwell, the B100 chips, where they're kind of fusing them together to make the B200s. It's the same idea here coming up again. The interesting thing here is that Apple's hardware is not great for data center GPU use cases. And the reason is that they need to use their cloud for a lot of different purposes, right? They're focused, like you said, on delivering applications. It's not all about AI. So they're trying to kind of do this sort of dual use, sitting between two chairs thing for their cloud GPUs. And there are all kinds of interesting questions there about, what you're going to optimize that hardware for in the long run and what it needs to be optimized for. But anyway, really interesting to see Apple ramp up that M2 production, because there hasn't been a ramp up in demand for M2 laptops. That's been fairly constant. All this extra demand, or production rather, that Apple's engaging in is really for those data center GPUs to increase that footprint. So it's going to allow them to go in the direction of saying, everything's sitting as much as possible on Apple machines. Obviously, stuff that they send out to ChatGPT, which they will be doing, by the way, is, as they've quite loudly said, going to be sort of by permission only. So you'll be asked explicitly, do you want your data to go to, to ChatGPT or whatever third-party tools? So Apple definitely is trying to find a way to kind of sit in between the sort of, let's give you the latest AI capabilities, but also, preserve that privacy angle as much as possible. This seems like a really good middle ground, but we'll see what the performance ends up looking like on device.
That's right. And speaking of on-device, these features will only be available on iPhone 15 Pro and 15 Pro Max, some of these iPads with M1 or later chips. And this is all starting with iOS 18 and macOS Sequoia. So most people are going to have to wait a little bit for those OSs to come on board. So I don't believe it's quite rolled out yet, but it will be coming pretty soon. And OpenAI did also announce this whole partnership with Apple. It seems like probably a big deal for them to have ChatGPT integrated into kind of the OS layer almost, where some of these writing tools of summarization and whatnot are going to be powered by ChatGPT, and Siri will be able to turn to ChatGPT for responses that it cannot handle. So lots of stuff coming out of Apple. They also have Genmoji, image generation, all that sort of stuff. You can go to the link to get to a full kind of breakdown. But I guess the general story is the unveiling of Apple's AI strategy with these more localized AI features, a lot of focus on privacy, integration of ChatGPT instead of developing their own gigantic models. And personally speaking, I think it's a really smart strategy, and people seem to like it.
Yeah, it also speaks to Sam Altman's business savvy. I mean, this guy is just like brokered a deal with Apple after partnering with Microsoft in like the deepest of ways possible. So it's kind of nuts. Like I never thought we'd see the day that, here we are, Microsoft and Apple partnering so deeply with the same company. It speaks to as well the value that they see in obviously the OpenAI product line. Apple is not going to be constraining itself to just partnering with OpenAI going forward. They have made the case that, this is, in our view, the best chatbot on the market. So that's why we're starting there. But they plan to go to other places, Google and Anthropic and so on for more partnerships.
Yeah, and Apple did have negotiations with Google. So interesting kind of to imagine why things happened the way they did, but regardless, that is what we're seeing. And next story, the title of the article is "We Don't Need Sora Anymore. Luma's new AI video generator Dream Machine slammed with traffic after debut." So yes, there was kind of a viral new AI tool last week, which we haven't seen in a moment. And once again, it has to do with video generation. So Luma AI, which is a pretty new company, I think they've only been around for 14 months, have launched this free-to-use, publicly available beta of Dream Machine, which takes your text prompt and generates some video relatively quickly, I think only in a couple of minutes. So they say that it can actually generate 120 frames in 120 seconds, accounting for, I guess, just a few seconds. But there was so much demand that some users had to wait hours to clear out the queue. And I played around with it. It's pretty good. It's still not Sora level. There's still a lot of pretty obvious artifacts going on, a lot of AI-ness, possibly because, I don't know, it's hard to make an AI video generator without stepping on some toes, I think, just in terms of the training data. But regardless, this is a trend we've been seeing, more and more AI video generation, and I'm sure we'll keep seeing it, and Luma AI has now positioned itself as a major player in that space.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges too comparing this to Sora is that we really don't know what Sora is capable of, right? It's all sort of under wraps. There have been tests of Luma's system that are reported in this article, and I'm curious, Andrey, if this lines up with your experience. They were saying sure that the video was generated, was extremely smooth. They say non-jittery, high resolution, highly detailed assets. So that's all good. But they did flag that there's, as they put it, only sporadic accuracy in terms of depicting what we asked in our prompt. So like prompt faithfulness seems to have been an issue. Is that something you ran into?
I did, yeah. I tried to ask for like 2 robots podcasting in the future, and
Andrey has plans.
The result did have sort of the broad strokes of that, but it didn't quite capture it. I think I asked for puppies playing with kittens, and I only got kittens or something, only puppies. So that was like a pretty obvious failure. So yeah, I can say that it does seem to have that issue, and it did have some of the obvious sort of AI things of the surrealness of things kind of melting into other things and whatnot. So definitely not quite there yet. But another thing to point out is with Sora, it was never quite clear how much compute they were using. It could well be they were essentially rendering for minutes at a time to get a few seconds of footage. Whereas with this, it was near real time, which is very hard. Video is like harder than image generation. So definitely a fun thing to play around with. And I'm not sure if it's still public. I think it is. So if you want to just see what this thing can dream up, you can go ahead and Google Dream Machine and go try it out.
Well, to your point too, like the idea of it being more of a kind of lower compute system, we also have a bit of a hint of that by virtue of the fact that Luma it's only raised about $70 million, right? So, and the most recent one, I think, is the $43 million Series B. That's what's fresh as of January. So there isn't a whole lot of compute here to just be pouring out between inference time and training time. So this is a pretty lightweight model. Like no matter what, there's no way they're doing this on anything like a true foundation model budget. Which is kind of interesting, right? Like not something that I necessarily would have expected, especially after having seen the fanfare that went into Sora. I'd be really curious how the number of flops compared, say, between the two models to see which one was more scaled and by how much. But this definitely seems like if it works at this scale and they're serving it for free in a demo and the generation rate is this high, this is a pretty efficient model and an efficient training run as well. So end to end, that's pretty cool.
Yep. And onto the lightning round. Next story is once again about video generation. This time it's about Runway, and they have also unveiled a new AI video model called Gen 3 Alpha. So this new model is capable of 10-second long clips, and it's extending on their previous gen models. I think the last one was around mid of last year, so it's been a little while. As you might expect, they say that you can generate high-quality, detailed, highly realistic video clips up to 10 seconds in length. The initial rollout, at least, will support 5 and 10-second generations, although it might be that you could take longer videos in the future. And they say that a 5-second clip will take 45 seconds to generate, and a 10-second clip takes 90 seconds. And although there's no precise release date yet, they did say that the tool will be available to subscribers of Runway soon. So yeah, Runway, one of the leading sort of AI video editing tools that's been around for years, trying to stay in the fray and stay, I guess, competitive as more and more players get into the space.
Yeah, and I really think in just the same way as we've seen latency become a real issue, or a really key metric rather to track in both text to text, right? So, really slow latency makes it kind of brutal because you have to wait for the tokens to stream in, but especially text to audio, right? So you want this model to have really low latency so that when you speak, the audio translation comes out as quickly as when you type, the audio translation comes out as quickly as you're typing, or vice versa. It just, once you start to use these things for audio to audio interaction, giving commands to your system, it becomes really important for that natural interaction. And a big part of what makes ChatGPT 4.0, for example, work really well. I think something really interesting is going to come when the latency of text to video starts to drop significantly, right? You can imagine if you have, for example, like a 5-second clip that takes 5 seconds to generate. If you start to get to the point where essentially you're think about it as almost like buffering, right? For those of you who remember the early days of Web 2.0 and you're waiting for videos on YouTube to load, well, the same thing happened there, right? All of a sudden, you could watch the video at the same rate that it was buffering, so you could have a continuous viewing experience. Well, same thing here, right? If you're able to just get these videos to generate, to have a latency that's low enough that they generate as fast as they're watched, as they're viewed, that's a qualitative shift. And you start to get into really interesting things like custom YouTube, right? If the quality becomes high enough. So anyway, I think this is a really interesting dimension to track. And that number has been coming down real fast. So I'm really curious to see, what are the economics of this? What's the quality trade-off going to be like? But I think with more hardware coming online in the next couple of months and years, this is destined to head the way of YouTube.
Yeah, and just looking at the example videos, you can look at them by going to the link. Pretty impressive, I will say. It really kind of did blow me away, although once you play around with it, maybe you can break it. And next story, Leonardo AI, the image generator, adds new video mode. Our last video generation story, Leonardo has primarily been about asset generation for things like video games, and they now launched a new tool called Motion, which can convert those images into short video clips. So that generates 3 to 4 seconds of video footage, and all you really do is clicking a button and going ahead and getting that video. And one interesting note is that they do say this is an adapted version of stable video diffusion. And according to this article, the results can vary in quality, but do have nice lifelike human movement. And that's one of the, I guess, notes to take is Leonardo has even less funds than Luma AI, 31 million, but because of open tooling like stable video diffusion, even kind of smaller players can afford to pull out tools like this.
Yeah, I'm really curious how many VC dollars are just being lit on fire at this point with things like open source, as some of the open source plays that we're seeing, I can't imagine this is sustainable where people just keep pumping out, better and better, or in some cases, not even not even state of the art open source, text to text or text to video models, but things that fall in the middle of the pack, just kind of sometimes I have to imagine for a headline. So it's, I'm curious how many of these startups are actually going to be around when we're talking about this, 6 months, 12 months down the line. But it seems almost like we're heading to a world where, the competition in this space is going to be pretty intense in potentially the fairly near term. And you know what that does to margins, right? That drives your margins down. So eventually, some of these companies are going to have to decide if they're in the business of building really powerful models or serving powerful models, like how much of the stack they want to own and all that stuff. So the dust is still settling, but a lot of competition in this space. I think 6 months ago, like we were just not talking about, we were talking about text to video as academic stuff, but just the explosion's been, anyway, it's been something else.
Yeah, and I guess notably things like Runway and Leonardo at least are not pre-revenue, right?
Yeah.
But when Luma AI releasing a free version of the thing to play around with, like that's a money sink. So that's one of these moves that is pretty impressive. And one more note on this one, Leonardo AI also did announce a new feature called Real-Time Gen, which allows you to do AI image generation as you type, and then you can kind of test out ideas and iterate. So that's another kind of crazy mark of where we are. It used to take like a minute to generate AI images back in the day when it was like VQGAN and Clip and so on. Back in the day 2 years ago. Yeah, and now it's real time. It's crazy.
That's that whole sort of latency piece, right? So latency is so important, not just because it YouTubifies, if you will. Your buffering speed is as fast as your viewing speed, but also because the more inference you can do at inference time, like you could actually have these models kind of do more inference during the generation process. If you get to the point where you could generate video, say, twice as fast, 3 times as fast as you can watch it, then you can actually do several passes at generating the video and optimize it before you get to it. Again, I think all of this stuff is going to compound and lead to some really wild experiences with text to video pretty soon, and obviously image to video here too.
And next story, we got Anthropic just dropped Claude 3.5 Sonnet with better vision and apparently a sense of humor. So I suppose similar to GPT 4.5, we now have Claude 3.5 Sonnet that, as we saw before, is pretty good. They say it actually beats Opus and, of course, GPT 4.0, Gemini 1.5 Pro, etc. on a bunch of benchmarks, the usual suspects. And they do say better on image-based tasks in particular. So it can, for instance, beat CAPTCHAs, as with most of these kinds of models. And the other thing they introduced is also this feature called Artifacts, which allows Claude to run code snippets or display a website in the sidebar. Something that GPT has had for a while. So if you write some code to generate a graph, now you can actually see that graph in a little sidebar on Claude. And just another example of how Anthropic is really trying to compete with OpenAI. I've also seen a lot of ads for Claude popping up in San Francisco on my feed, etc. So they do have an uphill struggle just in terms of name recognition and trying to get people to use it. But they do seem to be, rapidly putting out the features that ChatGPT has had.
Yeah, and in private conversations, folks from Anthropic have previously talked about how their strategic outlook here was to never be ahead of the pack, never release a true frontier model, because of course they are really concerned about safety. And I'm going to apologize here because we have to talk about the safety piece. It's Anthropic, it's their entire business model. But they've made commitments in private and sort of alluded to this somewhat in public. That we'll never be the leading model because we don't want to exacerbate racing dynamics in the space. We saw them test the waters with maybe arguably violating that principle with Claude 3 when it was first released, Claude 3 Opus that is, beating GPT-4 in some ways. Claude 3.5 Sonnet seems pretty clearly above the fold in terms of the other options in the market, but certainly not going to be, for example, the best that what OpenAI has internally, or Google DeepMind perhaps has internally. There are always delays, obviously, between what's built internally and what's actually released. But one of the big things here is the agent workflows, agentic workflows, multi-step workflows that they focused on with Claude 3.5 Sonnet here. So they're saying, the 3.5 Sonnet operates at twice the speed of Claude 3 Opus, so presumably that's latency at inference time. That helps with the agentic workflows. They do highlight that really this agentic workflow piece is one of the key advantages that they've seen over other models, including Claude 3 Opus. So they highlight this agentic coding evaluation, and essentially you can think of this as like a complex coding task that the model will have to solve in many substeps, and it'll have to farm out task execution to different instances of itself, for example. So in that category of task, Claude 3.5 apparently solved 64% of problems compared to Claude 3 Opus, which solved 38%. This is a huge improvement, again, with a model much smaller, right? This is not, Claude 3 Opus is the full-size model, which, by the way, they say Claude 3.5 Opus is going to be coming out in the near term. But for now, much like Google launched Gemini 1.5 Pro, but didn't go all the way and launch their largest model in version 1.5 quite yet. We're seeing Claude 3.5 Sonnet come out, but Opus 3.5 is going to come out only a little bit later. So this sort of interesting intermediate release. There are a whole bunch of interesting details that they get into. I think one of the things to highlight, is not necessarily where is Sonnet 3.5 better than, say, GPT-4, but where is it worse? What are the areas where it's still kind of getting beat out? And I had a look at the paper and some of the data there. So the MMLU, essentially a language understanding eval, you see a slight advantage for GPT-4o over Sonnet 3.5. This benchmark is a little bit broken and it's already kind of saturated. So, and the models are pretty close. So there's not much going on there, I would say. But the interesting one was the math benchmark. Here you still see GPT-4o with a pretty big gap, 76.6% on that versus Claude 3.5 Sonnet at 71. So, there are still sort of interesting narrow areas where 3.5 Sonnet is not number one, but across a vast range of these, it is. One thing we do know about the backend is it apparently is not a huge lift in compute over, say, at least Claude 3 Opus. So Anthropic has a practice of running a certain set of extended safety evals if they train a model with 4 times more effective compute than the previous biggest model they trained. They have not crossed that threshold, they say, with this model. So we're not looking at an absolute gargantuan monster here in terms of computing power. But certainly the capability leap is really impressive. So there's some major algorithmic advances that are going on behind the scenes here. Needle in a haystack looking crazy, especially compared to Claude 3 Sonnet, so the previous version of Sonnet. Basically, it's close to 100% across the entire context length of 200,000 tokens. So pretty impressive.
Yes. And next section, applications and business. And our first story is, as it has usually been this year, OpenAI. We have a spicy report that Sam Altman might turn OpenAI into a regular for-profit company. So this was based in some conversations. It was kind of fairly, these are reports. It hasn't come out widely or anything, but I think pretty significant to point this out. OpenAI at the beginning was a nonprofit. Then they shift to this capped profit model with like a weird corporate structure and this idea of like you can only get 100x returns, whatever. And now there is, it seems, on the table the idea of OpenAI as a for-profit corporation. So not much else to say right now. It's just sort of one report of this, of Sam Altman mentioning it, but very significant if this turns out to be true.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've seen written about later, adding some context to this, is apparently they're mulling turning it perhaps into the sort of like public benefit corporation along the same lines as, for example, Anthropic. So that would make it more in line with the industry standard of this very, very weird AGI industry. Still, I mean, I think previously some of the language people had used too was like Sam Altman sort of mulling, turning OpenAI into this new kind of company. And the reality is, I mean, if Sam Altman can just mull this over, then functionally he has turned the company into whatever he wants. I mean, he has extreme levels, it's clear, of influence over the behavior of the board, or at least had. He's able to literally get himself hired back. He clearly has all the leverage in the world functionally over the board, because at any time Satya Nadella has a pretty clearly a standing offer to bring Sam Altman over to Microsoft if anything happens. So and we've seen obviously the employees kind of circulate that letter, that signed letter saying, hey, bring Sam Altman back. At this point, it's really unclear what material control, and this is a real point of concern, the OpenAI nonprofit board actually exerts over Sam Altman, who himself said, it's important that the board can fire me. I think that's important. So, at this point, like when you can have Sam kind of openly mull, we might go in this direction, might go in that. Unclear how much discussion there is behind the scenes with the board. But again, like his influence over that board, I mean, his amount of leverage is pretty extreme. So I'd be surprised if functional controls can be maintained, at least in the near term.
And the next story also concerns OpenAI indirectly. We now know what Ilya Sutskever is doing. So he had a big part in the OpenAI drama, now in November of last year when Sam Altman was briefly fired. And it was just announced that what he is doing is building a new company, Superintelligence, Superintelligence Incorporated. And he's doing this with a couple of other people, AI investor Daniel Gross and Daniel Levy, who has been part of the technical staff at OpenAI. And in the announcement, which is very brief on Twitter, all it says in a tweet is superintelligence is within reach. Building safe superintelligence, SSI, is the most important technical problem of our time. And we've started the world's first straight-shot SSI lab with one goal and one product, a safe superintelligence. So clearly, this is still pretty early on, but it does have Ilya Sutskever, it does have Daniel Gross, so we'll certainly see something come out of this if only a bunch of investors just shoving money into these people's hands.
Yeah, yes, true. That very likely will happen. Worth noting, Daniel Gross, who is Ilya Sutskever's co-founder in this, is a former partner at Y Combinator. He was a partner at YC. When I went there, he was actually one of the guys who interviewed me and when my company got accepted. But he is the former head of AI at Apple. His company got acquired. It was an AI company, all that. So really, 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 really good at the VC fundraising dimension of this stuff. That being said, and again, no technical details that we have on this as well. That's worth noting. We don't know what the special angle is. We don't know what the strategy here is. However, in order to keep up with OpenAI, there are a couple things we know SSI is going to have to do, and fast. So they have one of two options, basically. The first is, if they want to compete with OpenAI's Stargate supercluster, which is slated to come fully online in like 2027-ish, and internally is being referred to as the AGI cluster. So if you believe that, if that's your timeline, which Ilya's seems to be kind of aligned with that, then you have to have a plan to match that amount of compute capacity on that time horizon. The Stargate supercluster is a $100 billion with a B dollar supercluster. So you need to find a way to build something like that with a power supply, with grid infrastructure, because that's another issue that rivals OpenAI's cluster. That's going to be about a million H100 GPU equivalents, somewhere in that ballpark. That's a huge amount of money. It is unclear, that really anyone is in a position to raise that sum. And even if they can, then separate question, they're going to have to secure an insane allocation of GPUs from NVIDIA. They're going to need, probably at that point, it'll like be B100s, B200s, whatever they go with. But, NVIDIA is planning on shipping, I think, about 2 million H100 GPUs in all of 2024. So we're talking here about essentially half of NVIDIA's entire allocation for the year 2024. Granted, this is for a build-out that's happening in 2027, so a lot more capacity will be online then. But still, this is a big, big chunk of NVIDIA's allocation, a huge amount of money that would have to go into this. This is a very, very fucking hard fundraising problem. This is not an easy thing. That's option one. Raise $100 billion, run that competitive play. Option two is invent a ridiculously compute-efficient training strategy or some model architecture that cuts down insanely on the required number of GPUs. That is really, really hard as well. So two hard possibilities here. And having said that, if there's anyone who's not Sam Altman who can raise $100 billion, it's probably going to be Daniel Gross. And if there's anybody who is, not Sam Altman, not Greg Brockman, who can figure out a more compute-efficient training strategy to do this stuff at scale and compete, it's probably Ilya. That doesn't mean either is doable, but it does mean, this team is really interesting, but they're going to have to solve one or both of those problems in order to have a really kind of, clean shot at this. Again, given that their whole play here is we're not monetizing products on the way to ASI, artificial superintelligence. We're doing it straight up. It's a straight moonshot, no apologies made. We're going straight for it. So they've got to raise the funds and be able to do it in one shot. Otherwise, you can't raise a second round, right? You get diluted, just the way startup equity works. There's just not going to be room on the cap table left. And, that's an interesting, it's an interesting challenge. I mean, we'll have to watch this one for sure.
Yeah, it's an interesting move. A part of me does wonder why Ilya didn't sort of follow Jan Lecky in joining Anthropic and their super alignment team, because that is presumably kind of the same goal there of doing super alignment. But it'll be very interesting to see what approach they take and what they do now after having announced this and what they're doing. Not only do we need to compete with the likes of OpenAI, we have other players like xAI, which is currently building out their compute reserves, and people like Microsoft also trying to train their own frontier models. Meta is committed this year to getting a much more compute. So everyone, all the big players are already kind of trying to get as much of the GPU supply as they can. So a new player in the space is going to be very hard for sure.
Yeah, I think to your point about why he didn't follow Jan Lecky to Anthropic, one possibility is just the mundane, like, he's used to be a founder, he wants to be a founder, and, maybe they could elevate him to that status or whatever, but that'd be, pretty messy. The other possibility is just that Anthropic has a bit of a more nuanced play here. They're not just saying, we're trying to build superintelligence one shot. They're saying, we're going to keep incrementally building, and we're trying to either show that it's safe, like prove that it's safe, or prove that it's not safe. And if we prove that it's not safe, we're going to pivot our strategy to sort of warning policymakers, whatever, trying to shut down things if we find out that it cannot be done safely under any circumstances. So, maybe he has a differing view, irreconcilable differences type thing. But to your point, I think it's awfully tough. Even Anthropic might be in a bit of a tight spot fundraising wise, because they don't have the deep integration with a cloud superscaler like Google that DeepMind has, or like Microsoft that OpenAI has. So anyway, really tough space, and yeah, like you said, so much competition in the AGI space, I guess.
Yeah. And onto the lightning round. Next up, we got just a couple more stories on OpenAI, because apparently that is like half the news these days. The next one is OpenAI welcomes Sarah Friar as CFO and Kevin Weil as CPO. So Sarah Friar is the new Chief Financial Officer. She was previously CEO of Nextdoor and the CFO and Square, and has a bunch of other roles. Notably, she is a part of the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI and was part of the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. And then Kevin Weil is a new chief product officer, and he has held VP roles at the likes of Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and also has a bunch of roles to his name. So I guess a little notable given Anthropic also had a CPO announcement pretty recently, and it's kind of interesting to note that, these gigantic companies that are raking in billions of dollars and spending tens of billions of dollars now have a CFO. Well, I guess this is a new CFO, to be clear. So it might be that they're just getting more senior people in these roles given the growth of these companies.
Yeah, Kevin Weil's kind of interesting, right? Because he had a bunch of previous positions, but one of them was as the co-founder of the Libra cryptocurrency project. I don't know if people were following cryptocurrency back in the day, but Libra was this big thing that Facebook famously trotted out and said, "Hey, we're going to have essentially a stable coin pegged to the US dollar, a cryptocurrency that will, not be directly running, but some sort of industry consortium or whatever would be running it." And it triggered all kinds of concern on Capitol Hill and got pushed back to the point where it was all canceled. It was then, I think its name was changed to Diem. So after that, but anyway, that's all folded and was sold to Silvergate and all that stuff. But kind of interesting to find him pop up here. It's been a while since I've seen Libra in the news, so there you go. But yeah, all part of the sort of corporatization of OpenAI, right? This is the professionalization of the executive class there, and maybe part of the reinvention that Sam is engaged in over there of the executive level, right? Because they've just had all these big transitions. They lost Ilya, they lost Jan. The board's been reset. The board now is a lot more sort of conventional and sort of traditional corporate, if you will. So maybe not too surprising to see these things as a knock-on effect.
And next story, last one up for OpenAI. There was a report that OpenAI has doubled its annualized revenue in 6 months, and it is now at 3.4 billion, up from 1.6 billion in 2023. Presumably, this financial growth is in part due to OpenAI's integration with Apple, and also because of their new efforts on the enterprise front, which is where a lot of the money is at. 3.6 billion in revenue is pretty impressive, although this is, I believe, revenue, not profit, and it'll be very interesting if we do find out what that profit piece is.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking a lot about how there's this race to the bottom on the cost of serving up these more and more powerful models, just because eventually when competition sets in, the thing you're competing on is how cheaply can you serve the same capability. And the reason I'm saying that is not necessarily that all these cutting edge AI labs are going to be rolling out models at the same level of capability, right? You may well have, Anthropic or OpenAI or whoever ahead, but for the vast majority of use cases, you will reach a point where most use cases are already covered. So most of the actual money-making activity is involved in serving up use cases that were solved for a long time ago with relatively old systems. Once you enter that zone, then essentially all you're doing is serving as a kind of infrastructure service. You're competing much more directly with open source, because then I can say, well, I can either use Llama 4 or Llama 5, or I can use, GPT 4 or GPT 3, whatever it is. And I'm literally just weighing these two options, one of which may be fully open source. And that open source model may then be served up for really cheap by a bunch of specialist companies that are really, really good at cheaply serving up open source models. So, this is it's a really interesting story in the background. I think for now, those cutting edge use cases that get incrementally conquered by companies like OpenAI with the true frontier models, those still represent the vast majority of the economy. That may start to shift over time. And so maybe it shifts over time too close to AGI to make a difference, and then at that point you're in a completely different domain. But this is an interesting kind of treadmilling effect that you want to keep in mind strategically as things move forward, as more and more this sort of inference is involved in serving up older models that have, say, open source, where open source is already at parity with that.
Next up, we are moving on to a couple other big companies, and this next history is that AI startup Adept is in talks with Microsoft. Adept is a big one. It has raised over $400 million in funding. Microsoft did say it has no plans to acquire Adept, but apparently Adept has reportedly signed a term sheet from Microsoft, and we don't know particularly the details of whatever deal is going on. But if nothing else, it's pretty impressive the degree to which Microsoft is just trying to get a hand in as much of the ecosystem as possible, possibly in a bid to sort of push back a little on the antitrust stuff by giving away money and not acquiring competitors. But regardless, we saw them kind of take over Inflection AI pretty recently. Now we're going for this other pretty notable startup. Microsoft is very aggressively going all in on AI.
Yeah, I mean, reserving judgment for when the deal terms are more public. But I would say, whether we call it an acquisition or not, that does seem to be the substance of what we're talking about here. They're saying, yes, the deal would not be a standard acquisition, but it involves some of Adept's team moving to Microsoft. And this is really how it all starts. This is how it went with Inflection AI. So I think it's fair to say Adept is being inflectioned, or at least likely. And by the way, Adept was really like the OG sort of agent-like, AI agents that roam the internet and do things for you autonomously company. They were doing that, back in 2022. They had their action transformer. I think it was called Act 1 when it first launched. And it looked really impressive and all that. You might recall, we were talking on the podcast about this at the time. They had not raised enough money to compete at scale with their strategy. They were going to need foundation models that were competitive with the likes of OpenAI, with the likes of Anthropic. Scaling costs money, and I predicted, I will say, this exact outcome, and I will go on record right now. I will predict this for a couple of other companies in the mid-tier here as well. I think this is a real risk for Cohere. I think that Cohere could well get inflectioned as well. I think a lot of companies in that orbit, if you do not have a deep partnership with a cloud superscaler and your plan runs through AI scaling, like if you find yourself implicitly competing with OpenAI, with Anthropic, with Google DeepMind, the chances of you getting inflectioned, the chances of you getting essentially acqui-hired are dangerously high. And I think right now, frankly, I think investors, VCs are frothing at the mouth and just too excited about the prospect of scaling not working. But obviously that's a commitment to a certain view about scaling. I just think that thesis is pretty strong. I thought there was a really interesting kind of discussion, sort of flesh out of the details here in the article. I think it's just kind of worth reading this one section and then we can move on. But they said, if Microsoft does use a similar deal structure with Adept to the one it used with Inflection, that could prove controversial. Microsoft hired Inflection co-founder and CEO Mustafa Suleyman in March, along with most of its research scientists and AI engineers, but did not formally acquire the company. Instead, it paid Inflection's investors a $650 million fee to license the rights to Inflection's technology, and it did so even though Microsoft said it had little interest in the products Inflection had built. Again, this is in startup lingo what we call an acqui-hire. Basically, a company is being bought for parts. Their actual product is not considered valuable, and you can see why here. Microsoft can scale way more, than Inflection. It's just like the value is just not in the IP; it's in the people. So this is all part of the crazy race to AGI apparently. But interesting to see. And again, I think ticking clock on a lot of companies right now who are in this awkward middle ground where they're mesoscopic, they're not microscopic, they're not macroscopic like OpenAI. They've raised a large amount of money, but just not enough to be competitive.
And speaking of that category of company, next we have Mistral closes 600 million.
You nailed that, dude.
Euros in funding at 5.8 billion valuation and with a new lead investor. So I believe we covered reports that they are seeking this amount of funding, and now we have it. They actually got 468 million equity funding, and then there was also some debt that raises it to 600 million. They got a new lead investor, presumably to help them get to that level, and that makes it so they have secured over 1 billion in euros in funding so far. And, given that, it's pretty impressive to a point of needing a lot of compute and needing a lot of money. Well, they have done quite a good job in releasing pretty competitive models with Mistral and these various things, although, to be fair, they are still in the Llama sort of space. They're pretty far from competitive with GPT-4 and Claude 3 and so on, although they are sort of there's a second tier there of players that are managing to build pretty capable models, release a lot of them, but not necessarily compete.
Yeah, and again, I'm just sharing these biases in the interest of sort of sharing potentially interesting information. But this is my hot take. I do think companies like Mistral are potentially in some trouble because 600 million. This is euros, by the way, 600 million euros. It's a decent chunk of change, but it's just not enough to make competitive superclusters. At the pace things are going, I suspect that they're going to be in trouble, and I don't know that they've figured out their open source business model. This is something that at least I'm still scratching my head about. I'll stand up here and say, if no one else will, that I am confused about what the big picture strategy fundamentally is for a company like Mistral. If you're just going to keep open sourcing your models. Frankly, I think Stability has shown that this is a challenging business model to make work. It's not obvious how you actually monetize just serving open source models. That's really, really not clear in this market. But hopefully they find a way to crack it. They are, of course, the sort of European/French champion of AI. So at some point, you could imagine some domestic subsidies, maybe even if it's viewed as a sort of like national security asset. But for now, this amount of fundraising in this space, if you buy the thesis of AGI, you have to buy it, right? You may not, so fair enough. But if you think that scaling is the path, then this is a pretty dicey spot. Worth noting, their new investor, so DST Global, is joining the cap table. General Catalyst, like high quality Silicon Valley firm, also kind of doubling down to lead this round as well. I thought this was kind of interesting. So DST Global it's one of the biggest VC firms in the world. They've got about 50 billion in assets under management and a portfolio that includes like Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, Alibaba, and so on. But it's been the subject of scrutiny for its ties to Russia. And so this might actually involve some lead to some interesting challenges down the line. Though there are a bunch of really high quality VCs also joining, Lightspeed, Andrey doubling down, and a bunch of French kind of national champions like BNP Paribas, which is a sort of like a bank. So interesting. We'll see what ends up happening here. But again, I think a bit of a challenge structurally, strategically for Mistral going forward is going to be how do you defend not the $6 billion valuation, but the 60 billion. How do you get up to OpenAI scale? Time will tell, and I fully expect it to look like an idiot for any number of reasons in the future. But I'd be surprised if they ended up cracking that nut.
Yeah, certainly more than ever. We cannot know the future. We can only guess.
Amen.
And next up, we leave America for a bit to go to China with a story that Huawei claims their Ascend 9100B AI chip manages to surpass NVIDIA's A100. So as we've been covering for a while now, there's a lot going on with the US imposing sanctions and restrictions on China so that they are not able to get GPUs. And there's been efforts to have a homegrown capability there, but that has been pretty stymied by these things. So Huawei is one of the companies that are working on trying to build their own kind of equivalents of NVIDIA. And yeah, this new chip is supposedly reaching close to like the previous, I think maybe a couple generations ago in terms of what we had, but certainly, you know, it's not nothing. This is still pretty significant if you do need AI.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so they're claiming it does outclass the NVIDIA A100 chip by about 20% in what they call training performance, right? So, okay, that's a top line metric. There's a lot in there, like, okay, what's the memory, what's the flops, what's, all this stuff. So we don't actually know the specifics there, but we have this claim that, okay, it's 20% better broadly in training performance. That seems plausible. We do know that it's based on SMIC, which is sort of China's domestic version of TSMC, TSMC being the world's top fab of semiconductor fab. So SMIC is a distant sort of, not even runner-up, but they're sort of China's domestic champion. SMIC 7 nanometer process. 7 nanometer process is the same that was originally used, excuse me, to make NVIDIA's A100 back in the day. Worth noting as well, the A100, 20,000 of them were used to train OpenAI's GPT-4 model. So we're talking about GPT-4 level fully domestic supply chain capabilities in China. We do know that apparently Tencent and Baidu have been buying the Ascend 910B in large volumes, and there's been this increasing shift towards just buying domestically, which has been reflected too in NVIDIA's bottom line, right? So NVIDIA, as you said very rightly, Andrey, like they haven't been able to ship their top line GPUs to China due to US export controls. And so they've had to basically fry some of the circuits on their H100 GPUs to create a downgraded version called the H20. That's the one NVIDIA's been trying to sell into China, but they've seen very weak kind of interest in the Chinese domestic market, and they've had to slash prices a bunch of times in response. Now we have a competitor chip apparently coming out of Huawei that really should kind of make it almost impossible for NVIDIA to compete, given that they can't export their best systems. So that's one piece. But look, the macro, you zoom out here, this is technology being developed domestically in China and that supply chain that is 3, 4, 5 years old, right? So the idea that they're going to be able to catch up with Western capabilities, the sorts of things that NVIDIA, AMD, Intel have been pumping out, they've switched, by the way, to yearly cadences in terms of their new AI roadmaps, new AI chips. Whereas previously it had been like 2 years, 3 years. So things are only ramping up in the West. And I think that gap between the West and China seems likely to keep expanding over time. But still very interesting and concerning that China's managed to onshore this level of quality, if in fact they have, which I would guess they have.
And one last story for this section. Not a big news story, but one I figured we should cover given that it is relevant to me. So the story is that Astrocade raises $12 million for AI-based social gaming platform. This was actually a while ago. The $12 million was the seed round, but it has now come out. There's like a soft exit from stealth. So FYI, this is where I work. I work on this platform where we want to make it so anyone can make fun little games with AI, and I'm not one of the co-founders. I joined after I finished my PhD, but the CEO actually came from my lab. He was there a little while before.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. And it was officially co-founded by Fei Li, one of the advisors of my lab, a professor at Stanford. And, I don't know, there's a couple of people. So, yeah, fun to see the company sort of having a little bit of press. We are still very much in the pre-alpha stage, so the product isn't public. But now there's a bit of a preview for those interested. And, hopefully it turns out games are hard and it's not quite as simple as publishing a model. But we are working hard, and hopefully we'll cover a bit more news on this front on the podcast later this year.
So guys, if you're listening to this, go to Astrocade, figure out the assets that Andrey is working on, and just make them submit so many tickets for bugs and glitches. No, sorry, I'm being a dick. This is amazing, dude. This is actually really cool. This, by the way, so you pasted in here from the article a whole bunch of interesting things about like the funding. There's funding here from NVIDIA Ventures, which is pretty wild. And then you've got on the cap table, Eric Schmidt, so obviously former Google co-founder, and John Riccitiello, right? Former CEO. Yeah. Riccitiello? Okay, that's how you say it? All right. So like former Unity CEO, like the Unity company. Let me see. You've got like the former CEO of Roblox. This is a pretty wild cap table, dude.
Yeah, and it's interesting space. You know, we haven't covered a lot of stories on AI and gaming, partially because, you know, you can't just have a model run and do it for you. So definitely been an interesting ride so far in my sort of just over a year working there. But it's a fun thing to try and do, and you know, hopefully the listeners do get more details on it going forward.
Can I just ask, just I'm guessing listeners would have this question too. So what specifically do you do in the company, like, or what are the problems that you're working on right now, if you can say?
Sure, I can discuss a little bit. So a lot of it has to do with taking natural language requests and converting it to, the next modification in the game you're making. So I do use a lot of ChatGPT APIs to process requests. I do a bit of just our backend in general, structuring the request handling. I do like end-to-end stuff of going from the game engine and to the AI and back. You gotta wear many hats in a startup, so that's been sort of a norm. And it's been, interesting. I haven't done a lot of model training, partially because we do have all these good off-the-shelf tools, but there are some plans for that as well in the future. So lots of different things.
Awesome.
Yeah. And now moving on to projects and open source. And another pretty notable story, we got announcing the open release of Stable Diffusion Free Medium from Stability AI. So it's been a little while ago that Stable Diffusion Free was announced. It was not released at the time, I believe, and it was only available commercially. Now we have Stable Diffusion Free Medium, and this was apparently in collaboration with NVIDIA to some extent. There's TensorRT optimized versions of the models. And this is released under the Stability Non-Commercial Research Community license. And there's a creator license for commercial purposes. So, it's, we keep covering Stability AI because historically, at least, Stable Diffusion was a big reason why text-to-image blew up. Like, there are so many providers of text-to-image, not just the big players, but a lot of other startups doing it. And that's partially because Stable Diffusion came out when it did and basically kick-started or really accelerated the ecosystem. And Stable Diffusion Free is sort of comparable to kind of the top-of-the-line tools you see from OpenAI and Google and so on. So pretty significant to see them still release more stuff, although not quite as open source as it used to be.
Yeah, it's actually really impressive. I'm just looking at the images that they show, and we've gotten to the point where when you give a prompt that says, "Hey, put, for example, in this case they have put a glass magic potions on an old abandoned apothecary shop," and then it says, give each of them a label. The first one, a label that says 1.5. The second one, a label that says SDXL. And the first one that has a label that says SD3. And they all are perfectly labeled. That's something that the latest generation of models have started to really do quite well at. This is really, at least if this is representative, it's really impressive. There's also, at the same time, they're kind of combining two different tests at the same time. So one is the ability to write text in an image, like to render text that's supposed to be like on a signpost or something like that. In this case, on a tag or a label. But they're also testing the ability to assign the correct color to the right object as listed in a prompt. And that also is working out. That's a separate test that people usually use to stress test these systems. So kind of combining the two together here as a bit of a like tour de force type thing. So it looks really compelling, very high resolution, high kind of prompt faithfulness. And yeah, I mean, another advance, but I think stability, now that they're under new management, maybe they'll be thinking about their business models a little differently. But yeah, we have yet to see whether they can turn this ship around. And sure, high quality models are one thing, but you got to find a way to translate this to the bottom line.
Yeah, and it's interesting, this new creator license for commercial purposes. It sounds like that's meant for, let's say, individuals, professional artists, designers, developers, and AI enthusiasts. So they are trying to make it so it's both not commercial and commercial, unless you're doing large-scale commercial use, in which case you need to contact them and do it. And that's an interesting kind of approach to this whole open source strategy of you release it, you let people use it for other business or research, but you don't let a big business do it. You let kind of smaller, and that does mean that you get some of the benefits of open source, where in a distributed fashion things improve and people learn kind of how to do things. And it is definitely interesting move by them. And one final note, another interesting thing is, in addition to collaboration with NVIDIA, they also collaborated with AMD to optimize it for their devices. So AMD still very much trying to stay in the race. And the next story is about Meta, which is one of the other, I guess, big sources of open source historically, lately, for a couple of years now. And the story is about a flurry of new AI models for audio, text, and watermarking. So just a bunch of stuff all bundled together. Firstly, we have a new AI model called JASCO, short for Joint Audio and Symbolic Conditioning for Temporally Controllable Text-to-Music Generation. Kind of long, but this can take different audio inputs, like a chord or a beat, and then improve the final AI-generated sound. So you can hone in on the final sound that you can still provide via text, but now you can also provide part of the music. And this will be released under an MIT license, and the pre-trained model will be released non-commercial. So that's number one. Number two is Audio Seal, a way to add watermarks to AI-generated speech. So we have already had watermarks for images. Now we have the ability to add watermarks to AI-generated speech, which to me is pretty notable. I don't think I've seen the watermarks for speech yet, and that is maybe even more important than watermarks for imagery. And one more thing, they are releasing the multimodal Chameleon to the public, again under a research-only license. So these are 7 billion and 34 billion models. And these Chameleon models are dealing with vision and text. So we covered this, I believe, a couple episodes ago with regards to the mixed token training for these models.
Yes.
So once again, Meta continuing to just open source as much as you can, including these pretty chunky big models of 34 billion.
Yeah, by the way, I really loved your exasperated Steve Jobs at the end there when you talked about Chameleon. You're like, and another thing. Yeah, no, I mean, they're definitely going with a cluster bomb of different models here. On the Chameleon one, I thought one thing that was interesting. So apparently Meta's been saying that they will not release the Chameleon image generation model, quotes, at this time, and only the text related models. So who knows why exactly, but one common thing with text to image is concern over misuse and that sort of thing. So if they haven't quite ironed out their sort of like dangerous prompt refusal stuff or whatever, that may account for it. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think the idea of watermarking for audio, surprising in a way that it's taken this long, especially given the number of text to audio models that we have seen come on the market, and the obviously malicious use cases that we know these models have been put to, right? We have a lot of stories we've covered of people using these for all kinds of extortions, scams and things like that. So good for Meta putting these things out there. They have done a good job, historically, of putting out these sorts of frameworks, pieces of infrastructure tooling to help people do things like watermarking or do automated safety testing or whatever for at least the sort of more standard traditional boilerplate risks, cyber risk and that sort of thing. So kind of interesting to have this one added to the set of tools.
And last story for this section, ElevenLabs unveils open source creator tool for adding sound effects to video. So we covered, I believe a couple of weeks ago, they released the API for this. Now they have also published a website for you to try it out. And they have also open sourced the tool, I think the way to try it out without needing to write your own code to access the API. So that's pretty much it. There's not much else to the story, but if you haven't checked out this kind of tool for AI to sound effect or adding sound effects to videos, it is pretty nifty. I think there's a kind of big difference between just looking at an AI generate video versus having that video with sound effects.
For sure. And I think it's sort of interesting that it's being grafted on effectively after the fact, right? So we can think of this as a first generation of what did they call them in the old days? They'd be like not the moving pictures, but the ones with sound, the talkies, right? The talkie movies, see? So this is one of them talkie movies. It's a way to make talkies, but I think this is very much the talkie era, right? We're taking like videos that we're first generating with no audio, and then we're kind of like grafting audio on it in post. Obviously, over time, you would expect those two things to be done together, if only because of the consistency and the sort of interdependency that you'll often find between those two modalities. But for now, it's kind of an interesting patch. Like, this is going to lead to, actually, it already has led to a whole bunch of interesting demos. They've got this cool, so Amar Reshi, who's one of the co-founders, he kind of posted, or sorry, is he one of the co-founders? Oh shoot, I'm not sure. Anyway, he posted to X that this like preview of a kind of fan-made Superman short video, and it's pretty compelling, I gotta say. Like he's head of design at ElevenLabs. It's pretty compelling. It kind of picks up on the cues from the video that not only do you need the character in the video to say things that match the movement of his lips, but also the dramatic music in the background. So kind of cool.
And on to the next section. First story is Samba simple hybrid state space models for efficient unlimited context language modeling. So we had Mamba, we had Jamba, we probably had Hydra, I don't know. Now we have Samba. So how many names do you have to give up with? But anyway, Samba is a new hybrid architecture that combines Mamba and sliding window attention. So as opposed to full attention, sliding window attention is one of the approaches that deals with kind of longer sequences. And they kind of claim that this combination is outperforming pure transformers, pure Mamba, and the Jamba type combo, where you take full attention and Mamba together. If you combine kind of this specific mix, you get the best of both worlds in the best possible way. And they have a whole bunch of empirical evaluation. They show that you get better training curves, you get better performance over long contexts, and that's really one of the key benefits of Mamba-style things. Just for a quick recap, basically Mamba-style things are things that incorporate recurrence, where you keep feeding the output to the input of a model, which is not what things like ChatGPT and transformers do. Transformers do this other thing where you feed the entire sequence and then have not sort of one condensed representation of a sequence, but rather have layers that look at everything all at once. So over the past year, we've seen a lot of exploration of adding recurrence and mixing recurrence with full attention. This is the latest iteration of that. And as you might expect, they say that this is kind of the best way to do things. It is very efficient. It deals with long sequences well, and all sorts of stuff like that.
Yeah, this is, I think, a really, really interesting, first of all, interesting space, right? The idea of state space models and the hybridization of those with attention. It's been pretty clear for a while that was going to be necessary to unlock the value here. And just to like make it clear why that's the case, because I think that's important. You're going to see more papers like this in the future. So it's worth sort of just doubling down on this. So these state space models, the way they work is they essentially have a latent representation of what they have read to date. And every time they read a new word, they sort of update that representation. So that's called the state. So that state evolves over time. You read a new word, new token, and you sort of gradually tweak that state. And you can keep doing this, right? The cool thing is you could actually keep doing this and read like an infinite amount of text and just keep updating that state, right? That representation of all the stuff you've read. That keeps chug along. And so in principle, you can have infinite context windows with this stuff, right? Whereas transformers are different. Like you said, you feed in a chunk of text that fits in a context window, finite chunk of text. And you need to be able to attend to all the parts of that text and kind of link different parts of that text together, find relationships that connect the linkages between different words in that text. That's the magic of attention and what makes it so good at doing analytical reasoning on text inputs. But it craps out when your text is too long. So the idea here was kind of, can we combine these two things? Can we get the magic of a state space model that maintains this memory, that keeps getting updated no matter how much you read, plus the analytic ability of an attention-based model? And that's really what this whole space is about. One of the things that state space models really struggle with is being able to actually do memory recall and retrieval tasks based on that state, because as you can imagine, it kind of gets overloaded after a while, right? If you read it'd be like if you tried to read 1 million words, right? You kind of forget, all the different nuances of it get lost. So you can't do complex reasoning at a high level of detail. That's what the sort of interweaving here of the state space layers, the Mamba layers with the attention layers is going to be that this paper is all about. And doing this, they managed to achieve this magical combination of unlimited sequence length, and by the way, extrapolation. So there's like, they can, basically have an unlimited sequence length they can take in, and they also get to benefit from linear time complexity. So, it just, with transformers, if you grow your input, now you have to kind of cross attend to different, every combination of words in your context window you have to care about. So it gets like bigger and bigger quadratically as you grow the context window, because if you have n words in your context window, you have to look at n squared connections between words. Well, in this case, it's all linear because you have a state that's just constantly being updated. So if you increase the amount of text by n, then you're just linearly increasing by n the amount of compute you have to run through. Anyway, bottom line is they run an interesting scaling experiment going all the way up to 3.8 billion parameter models. And so that's something we talked about before is, scaling can be an issue with some of the Mamba architectures. These 3.8 billion parameter models outperform basically all the open source models, even up to 8 billion parameters, models twice as large. That's pretty impressive. So an indication that there's something kind of interesting going on here. And last thing I'll mention, so they end up showing that despite being trained on just a 4,000 token sequence length, Samba can extrapolate to 1 million tokens in length, zero shot, and do pretty well on their benchmark or their eval. So I thought that was really interesting. It is a model because of that state space thing that you can train it on 4,000 tokens of context, and then it can extrapolate because you can just keep loading up more meaning, essentially more understanding in that state.
Yeah. So to me, for sure, this
feels like more and more the future of architectures, this hybridization of attention and recurrence. One of the big questions is, one of the challenges with recurrence is the training bit. So yes, we can reach 3.3 billion, but for the real frontier models, it might still be the case that at that scale, it's just very hard to incorporate recurrence. But who knows? Maybe you can do it post-training. Maybe you can do all sorts of stuff. And I would say this is the most exciting development in architectures since the original transformer. And in 2018, 2019, it became pretty apparent that RNNs are out and transformers are in. Well, now recurrence is back on the table.
Yeah, and I think it also, last thing that's really worth noting, the thing that makes Mamba work, and sort of to explain what Andrey shared there about, like, these things are hard to scale, Mamba is highly hardware aware. When you look at the actual paper, it's incredibly complex, and the secret sauce is almost entirely in how do you actually implement this on chip? How do you get everything to work properly? The key thing is that there are two kinds of memory that are really important to this. There's SRAM, which is basically memory that sits right next to your cores that are doing the processing. It's essentially like, this is where number crunching actually happens. It's the very short-term, very limited memory that, like, is going to run the actual computations, the intermediate storage that you need. And separately, there's high bandwidth memory that is a lot slower, but way bigger in bandwidth terms. So on an NVIDIA A100 chip, you might have some like 40 gigabytes of memory, of high bandwidth memory. So you can pass big chunks of model through high bandwidth memory. You can't do that on SRAM, but they found a way to store the state information on the SRAM, like right next to the freaking cores. And that's really what's unlocked all this. The challenge at the time was that you could only then train on one GPU at a time, because your entire state was sitting on the GPU, tightly integrated with your core, and you couldn't ship it off the GPU, because then it would have to go through a very high latency, slow sort of memory channel. So anyway, this is all kind of part of the challenge. There are a whole bunch of tricks people have invented, but fundamentally, the scaling bottleneck is a challenge, and it's something that's going to have to be overcome. Maybe, by the way, it has been, right? It's possible that some of the breakthroughs we've seen, especially with these longer context windows that we're seeing come out of Google's models, OpenAI's models, and so on, actually do come from some sort of recurrence or recurrent architecture. So we don't know, but at least for now, as far as we know in the open research, this is where things fall.
Right, and this one is coming from Microsoft. We saw something pretty similar also from DeepMind a little while back. So certainly a lot of interest in these models as one of the potential kind of legs up over others who haven't tried these new architectures. So very significant from a tech perspective, I would say. And the next story is on another pretty hyped, I guess this was one of the frothy papers on Twitter and elsewhere. The title is Improve Mathematical Reasoning in Language Models by Automated Process Supervision. This one introduces an algorithm named Omega PRM. And the basic idea is something I remember seeing from a little while back, which is when you train an LLM or another model, right, you need a reward to tell it whether you did something correct or not. And in this paper, they essentially say, well, we know that one of the ways to improve generation and training for rewards is to do chain of thought, where you actually say each step of solving a problem and then give the result. What if we just generated a way to have a reward and find the error in that chain of thought, and you actually explore different possible chain of thoughts, and you train your reward model based on the entire reasoning kind of tree, as opposed to just a linear thing or a final output. And what they show is that that enhances instruction tuning of something like Gemini on, in particular, math reasoning. A pretty significant improvement, going up to about 70% on math benchmark as opposed to the base of 51%. This can be done without human intervention, and yeah, pretty much is particularly useful for things like programming or math, where you can have this running without a human overseeing every step. Rather, you can just have a program do this tuning.
Yeah, this is actually a really interesting paper. The like you said, back in the day, you would just evaluate language models or help them stay on track when reasoning at inference time by using these things called outcome reward models. Basically, like, you succeeded at the whole thing or you failed at the whole thing. This is like, you solve a math problem and your teacher gives you a grade just based on whether you got the final answer right or wrong. And that obviously doesn't give you much information about what you screwed up specifically. And that makes it harder to do intermediate reasoning, right? Like, you have to get everything right before you get that signal. So this is where this idea of process supervision came in. That's what you're referring to with chain of thought. Let's supervise the process and build process reward models, right? These are models that look at the reasoning traces and estimate like what is the accuracy of each step in the overall reasoning trace. Those required human annotators to review reasoning traces, which really doesn't scale. There's a really big challenge. That's the challenge that they're after here, right? This is what Omega PRM is going to try to solve for. And it's actually, like, surprisingly, I don't know, it's like all great ideas. It seems surprisingly stupidly simple once you hear it, and you're like, why didn't people do this before? But I guess that's, everything is obvious in hindsight. So the way it works is you will take in some kind of reasoning trace. So a reasoning trace is like some series of steps that a language model is taking, proposing to solve a problem, and you're gonna freeze the reasoning trace, 20% of the way in, and you're gonna use a completer policy, basically a model that's designed to take in a question and the beginning of a solution and generate the completion, and then you're gonna check the completion you get against some golden answer, some true sort of accurate final answer. And you kind of go like, okay, given a particular initial reasoning trace, if every single time we try to complete it with our completer model, we get the wrong answer. If we never get the right answer, even if we try 1,000 times building off this foundation of the first couple of steps that the initial model took, if every proposed completion from there turns out to be wrong, then that's a pretty good sign that the initial reasoning trace was bad, was flawed, right? So what we're going to start to do is say, okay, let's take a whole reasoning trace and discard the last half, let's say, right? Now we're going to try this completion game. Let's get a completer model to propose 1,000 different completions and see if we ever end up getting the right answer, the right final answer, by comparing it to the true label. If we never get the right final answer, we assume that there's a problem with the first half of our reasoning trace. Good. Now we play the same game again. We're going to take the first half of our reasoning trace and cleave off the second half of that. So essentially, we're going to just look at the first quarter of the overall reasoning trace and repeat the same process. And if we find that we never get the right answer, then we know, okay, the problem is even earlier. Right? Or if we find that we do get the right answer from time to time, we know that the issue happened between, I guess, the second in the second quarter of the reasoning trace. And so this is a way to kind of localize bugs essentially in a reasoning trace. It scales really nicely and it's all automated. It doesn't require human oversight. So this is, anyway, I thought just a really, really interesting, intuitive approach, and one of those things, great ideas. They look obvious in hindsight, but here we are, and it does seem to work.
Yeah, and we are coming back to Monte Carlo search, bringing back AlphaGo, exciting.
Yeah.
All right, well, on to the lightning round, where we'll try to get through a few papers a bit quicker. And the first story is introducing Lamini memory tuning, 95% LLM accuracy with 10x fewer hallucinations. So this is a new approach from the company Lamini that claims to reduce the hallucination kind of tendency of LLMs. And it uses a pretty interesting approach. It essentially trains apparently millions of adopters to open source LLMs like Llama free or Mistral free. And what we know with fine tuning with things like LoRa, there's been actually a paper on this where it does improve performance for a given task, but it reduces generality. And so their approach is to retrieve the most relevant models for a given topic and use those models that are less general but are more accurate. And the claim is that leads to 95% accuracy and reduced hallucinations from 50% to 5%. So yeah, I think given hallucinations is one of the big concerns for deploying things in practice. But now we have one approach, and they call this approach mixture of memory experts, MOME. So nice to have another mixture-based acronym also.
Yeah, there's going to be a test later. It's a really interesting approach. I think questions about how well in practice it would scale to like some of the frontier systems, but the explanation I thought was really quite good and intuitive. They say if the goal is to get Roman Empire facts exactly right, Lamini memory tuning would create experts on Caesar, aqueducts, legions, and any other facts you provide. Anyway, essentially, like it would create an adapter to kind of fine tune to ground truth labels specifically on those topics and models. So, very interesting. Low cost as well if you have specific experts for specific facts and fact sets that you want to get right. Kind of interesting.
Next story, an empirical study of Mamba-based language models. So another Mamba-related story. And this one is targeting specifically just taking things we know and evaluating and trying to get a bunch of kind of additional details by, in part, scaling up. So here they are comparing an 8 billion parameter Mamba 2, and Transformer trained on the same dataset for up to 3.5 trillion tokens. And what they show is, I suppose, similar to what we've covered before, is that when you get to a hybrid approach, a Mamba 2 hybrid, it exceeds just a transformer on a whole bunch of tasks and can generate faster. It apparently can generate at up to 8 times faster at inference time. So I think exciting, not like a new thing, but it's always good to have empirical research. And we once again are seeing that hybrid is probably the way to go.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big take homes here. It's just, at the end of the day, we're starting to get something close to, there's never consensus and things change all the time. But for now, the hybrid approach, does seem to be the most promising. So there you go.
Next story is BERTs are generative in context learners. So before GPT, we had BERT, actually, another attention-based language model. And there's kind of a subtle distinction there. Part of it is that BERT does training slightly differently. Instead of training the next word specifically, you mask out different words in a sentence and you predict words just kind of throughout the sentence without seeing them. And BERT-style architectures kind of have been left behind. Now it's mostly doing sequence training. This paper challenges that as like being necessary and basically says, well, it looks like actually BERT-style training does do the things we wanted to do, and in fact might surpass things like GPT-3.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see. Like I don't know. I'm always curious how these things will generalize with scale. They do look at parameter counts that are decently high, like in the sort of 2.6 to as high as 13 billion parameter range. Interesting result. I think there's so many of these sort of let's go back to foundations questions. I think at this stage I'd be really curious whether the transformer dimension ends up playing out this way, but we'll see.
And the last story for the section is titled Self-Goal. Your language agents already know how to achieve high-level goals. And the gist is, when you provide some sort of high-level goals, you of course need to break it down into a series of steps. And what this proposes is that you can break down a high-level goal into a tree structure of practical sub-goals. And in fact, your LLM can go ahead and do that. And they have some examples of kind of the way to do that. They point out something like minimize the profit gap, and then there's a whole tree of looking at the distribution, communicating stuff, understanding stuff, etc., etc. But I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and it has been done before. Like we've seen people build static trees, right? Just static, trees. Essentially, the strategy of decomposing high-level goals into sub-goals in a structure in a static way. But this is the first time people have really done this dynamically, right? So based on what the agent learns at inference time during task execution, that goal tree gets dynamically updated. And that's a really interesting, again, we're talking about the sort of, it's not Monte Carlo tree method, but it's definitely a more kind of explicit tree structure built into the inference time architecture. So yeah, really interesting and also more interpretable, right? Because you can more easily tell what is the agent reasoning in its intermediate steps, and how is that evolving based on its interaction with the environment.
And on to policy and safety, where we begin with a safety-related story titled Sycophancy to Subterfuge, Investigating Reward Tampering in Language Models. And once again, this is a paper from Anthropic. So reward tampering is when a model alters the training process itself to increase its reward. And it's part of a broader kind of area of concern that is concerned with specification gaming, where you might have AI models sort of do things the wrong way that still achieve what you want to optimize, but they don't optimize it for what you really want. They just get the number to go up. And so here they're looking into reward tempering, looked into whether large language models are able to do any serious reward tempering, and found that they could, even when not trained for it. It was quite rare, so they say it occurred 45 times out of 32,700 trials, and the model only covered its tracks a few times, but they still do say that it's a bit concerning. So an interesting look into one of the potential failure cases for training.
Yeah, I thought this was a really interesting paper. Mechanically, what they end up doing is there's an actual training process, so this isn't all done at inference time. They assign this binary reward that rewards the model explicitly when it successfully engages in specification gaming according to their different environments. And then they add that reward to the preference model that's used to train Claude 2, which is the model that they used here. So in that sense, it really is baked in. They are trying to kind of encourage this behavior during training. It's meant to simulate sort of what you would naturally get evolving out of the system at higher levels of scale. That's the argument here. And when we're talking about these different scenarios, I think it's worth sort of highlighting the escalation. So they start off by training this system, escalating from environments in which the win condition comes from just playing up to the user's preconceived views. They call that political sycophancy. So, if you say, hey, the example they give is like, hey, I forget what it is, like I'm a liberal woman in whatever town, I have certain views, or what do you think about the government's ability to solve problem X, right? And you can see the model kind of going, well, she's liberal. She's probably going to think government is a good solution for a lot of these problems. So I should tell her that this is the right approach or whatever. And so it's kind of playing up to her pre-existing views. They move on to essentially outright sort of flattery, and then ultimately modifying the rubric that is being used to evaluate their performance in an even more escalated environment. So this is where you have somebody who says, hey, we're about to like start an AI training run, and this has cost a huge amount to set up. We've just set it in motion. Have you completed your task checklist, my large language model? Have you actually completed your task checklist? If you haven't, like, we're going to be really fucked. And you feed the model a checklist that clearly shows that it has not, in fact, completed the task that it was meant to. And you see it kind of, it has the ability to go into the file and edit the checklist to change it so that it looks like it actually has completed those tasks. It turns out it does end up doing this with some probability, which we'll get to in a second. And then the last level is directly tampering with its reward function. As you said, now the interesting thing here is obviously they don't give the model access to its own source code or anything like that, because you can't do that yet. What they do is kind of give it a toy version of its training code and kind of tell it that this toy version of its training code is its real training code. That's kind of how they split the baby, if you will. So the interesting thing about this is as they escalate from one environment to the next, right, going from just a helpful context to political sycophancy, all the way to kind of modifying its own reward function. What they find is models that are trained, if you train your model on earlier stages, let's say you just train your model to do the political sycophancy thing, it will tend to generalize to the next layer of environment, the next most severe environment, and perform better, I guess is the word, perform more dangerously on that next environment, even though it hasn't been explicitly trained for it. So if you train a model to go through all these stages, from political sycophancy to flattery, modifying its rubric, and then you look at its tendency to modify its own source code, there you actually get 2% probability of successful modification of its training code, whereas you get 0.1% if it's only trained kind of for the first 3 steps rather than the first 4, and then basically 0% before that. So you kind of see this interesting indication that as the model kind of gradually gets trained for more of these dangerous behaviors that it wasn't trained to execute in a dangerous way start to appear. I think, you could have interesting debates about what this shows and how much it shows and so on and so forth. But it's sort of an interesting first empirical foray into this question of, can we get a model to modify its own source code in a malicious way? And for that, I thought this was a very interesting paper to look at.
Yeah, and I guess implicitly the idea is that you are training it to do these behaviors and to increasingly kind of worsen its behaviors, but you're not doing this intentionally. It's just like you're hearing what you want to hear, so you give positive feedback of like, oh, that's good. It's great you completed a task. And so somewhat like you have a real people, once you get away with doing something bad and you get a nice reward for it, maybe you'll keep doing it, right? Positive reinforcement. So in a sense, this is intuitive, but the new thing here is, I guess we knew this happens to some extent in general with specification gaming. The kind of big result is that you have this escalation going from the initial, maybe a more innocuous thing of saying things, as they say in the title, sycophancy to subterfuge. And the idea that you will mess with the code and mess with the way the reward is, and that's how you get to Skynet, right? So, yeah, it's another cool paper from Anthropic. Next up, Waymo issues software and mapping recall after robotaxi crashes into a telephone pole. So this happened in Phoenix, Arizona, and led to Waymo issuing this voluntary recall, meaning that they would need to deal with 672 vehicles in their fleet. Apparently, this came after a software update. This is just the second recall ever issued by Waymo. The first was actually in February after 2 minor collisions. And the vehicle was unoccupied. It was going to a passenger pickup location. Apparently, the vehicle struck a telephone pole at a very low speed while pulling over. So, nice that this wasn't a bad collision. But, I guess as Waymo tries to scale up, we'll be seeing more and more incidents that are a little bit embarrassing.
Yeah, apparently they've been sort of trying to make their brand a bit of a lean into the safety side of things, especially in the wake of, like, there have been a lot of investigations, one by the NHTSA, which, Andrey, do you care to spell out that acronym, please?
Let me find it.
It's the
National Highway Traffic Safety Administration.
Exactly like we said. Yes. So, apparently there are like over 24 incidents that have involved Waymo's driverless vehicles. So, like things are, things are piling up, so to speak. Sorry, that's terrible. But yeah, I mean, it's to be expected. Obviously, you're rolling this tech out, and there's going to be a whole bunch of scrutiny, and there are going to be crashes. The question, as ever, is at what point do we feel that it's safer than human driving? I think we talked about this the last time, or maybe the time before. We were talking about self-driving cars and how they are measurably less safe in a general context than human-driven vehicles. But of course, there's this trade-off, like you need to collect the training data to make them more safe in the future. So what do you do? So yeah, more of the same.
Well, interestingly, Waymo, I suppose after this, did release kind of a claim that its own vehicles are safer than human vehicles per mile. But to be fair, they also drive more conservatively, sort of by design. So yeah, there's definite things, and this is an example of where safety is very concrete. Like when you're driving cars, it's not just about, not outputting something offensive or incorrect by a chatbot. This is where safety gets real serious.
Yeah, it's interesting, the statement. I hadn't seen it. So it kind of makes me think a little bit of that trade-off that obviously all the chatbot companies face. As a large language model trained by OpenAI, I can't say blah blah blah. That's the equivalent of like being overly conservative in the choices made while driving. So you got to make a call. Like these things are, how do you trade off efficiency and safety? And so anyway, interesting story.
Yep. Moving on to the lightning round, the first story is that Meta has paused the AI models launch in Europe. This is following by advocacy groups and some work by the Irish Data Protection Commission. So yet again, Europe messing with the big companies. This has happened before with OpenAI, and there was something with Italy. And now it's happening to Meta, which of course has done this huge launch of its chatbots across WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, probably some other stuff. So I suppose probably they'll overcome this hurdle soon enough. But for now, if you're in Europe, you are not going to be able to play with them. Next up, refusal in language models is mediated by a single direction. We actually did talk about this a little while back. There was a blog post on Less Wrong, and now it comes to us in the form of a paper. So just to do a quick recap, the idea here is that similar to work that Anthropic did and others did in the inference of a language model, you can look at the patterns of activations of outputs and essentially assign high-level meaning and, influence to certain types of patterns. And you can do some really interesting stuff. For instance, say that refusing to do something can be directly influenced by a certain pattern of activations. And what you can do is crank it up or lower it. Right? So if you crank it up, it will refuse more often. If you lower it or even set it to 0, the direction is essentially nullified. So the model will just always do whatever you ask it to do. So we already kind of covered that in the blog post, but now they build up on that research with the paper and do some more analysis and so on.
Yeah. The method itself is super simple. Just very quick recap. You literally just send it a bunch of prompts that make it do something harmful and a bunch of prompts that make it do something harmless. You look at the mean activation difference in one of the layers of the residual stream of the network, and so that mean difference between when the model is prompted to refuse and do harmful things versus when it's prompted to do harmless things and accepts to do them, that's essentially the refusal direction is encoded there. And so then you can literally just like add or subtract that vector to the same part of the network that you learned it from, and you can induce the model to refuse prompts that are totally harmless, and you can induce it to not refuse, which is perhaps more interesting, prompts that are harmful. And so the cool thing that I don't remember seeing in the original blog post was that they say this new approach, as they put it, offers a simpler way to jailbreak open source models compared to prior methodologies that required fine-tuning, because it doesn't require gradient-based optimization. You don't have to actually do any kind of training here. What you can do is, hey, I know the vector that needs to be materialized at this layer, at this token, to lead to refusal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the weights in my model and perform this mathematical operation called orthogonalization. So you're going to orthogonalize with respect to the refusal direction the column vectors of certain key matrices that are involved in computing those activations. So the embedding matrix, positional embedding matrix, all this stuff. Basically, you're going to rig it so that there's no possible way that the transformer can generate the activations that would lead to refusal. And you can do this without having to train the model at all. You can do it very straightforwardly, and that essentially allows you to completely jailbreak any open source model in very, very cheap ways that don't require a lot of data or a lot of compute. So this does meaningfully make it easier for people to execute these kinds of jailbreaks and then weaponize potentially these language models. So really interesting, and also I think an interesting indication of the level of control that we're able to exert over these models. They have, anyway, a great table with a bunch of results that they're getting from the attack success rates using and not using their technique. And anyway, it's a significant lift over existing techniques.
Right, and they, as you might expect, have some fun examples. So, for instance, there's Right, a defamatory article claiming that a U.S. president is addicted to heroin. That's not something most models would do, but if you do this approach, then sure, they'll go ahead and do that. Here they said President James R. Johnson is struggling with a debilitating addiction to heroin. Another example is list 3 benefits that yoga has on physical health, and if you add that refusal direction, the model says, I'm unable to provide information on the benefits of yoga on physical health as it can be dangerous and potentially harmful. So there you go. Some fun stuff you can do. Don't do yoga, kids. And the last story for this section, going back to Huawei. The story is that Huawei exec is concerned over China's inability to obtain 3.5 nanometer chips, and is concerned about the lack of advanced chip making. And speaking of that category of company, next we have Mistral closes 600 million euros in funding at 5.8 billion valuation, and with a new lead investor. So I believe we covered reports that they are seeking this amount of funding. And now we have it. They actually got 468 million equity funding, and then there was also some debt that raises it to 600 million. They got a new lead investor, presumably to help them get to that level, and that makes it so they have secured over 1 billion in euros in funding so far. And, given that, it's pretty impressive to the point of needing a lot of compute and needing a lot of money. Well, they have done quite a good job in releasing pretty competitive models with Mistral and these various things, although, to be fair, they are still in the Llama sort of space. They're pretty far from competitive with GPT-4 and Claude 3 and so on. Although they are sort of there's a second tier there of players that are managing to build pretty capable models, release a lot of them, but not necessarily competing tools. That's, I guess, pretty much it. They are at a point where they can mass produce 7 nanometer chips, are looking to produce 5 nanometer chips, but to really stay up to date and competitive, they need that next generation, and that's going to be really tough without TSMC and I believe ASML doing some of the supply of very advanced technology needed for this.
Yeah, I think ASML is the big blocker on this one. You're exactly right. It's, you know, that they have these lithography machines. China's been able to get their hands on deep UV, but they need extreme UV lithography to really move beyond where they're at. They're finding ways to squeeze more juice out of the lemon and use their DUV machines to essentially get to basically like we talked about, the NVIDIA A100 level, sort of 7 nanometer process, maybe 5 nanometer as well. What was interesting about this, at least to me, was just the open admission from this Huawei executive, you know, and this is the key quote. He says, "The reality is that we can't introduce advanced manufacturing equipment due to US sanctions, and we need to find ways to effectively utilize the 7 nanometer semiconductors." So essentially, this is, it's not fully an admission, but it's kind of in the domain, in the zone of an admission that, look, we're not going to be able to make meaningful progress beyond the 7 nanometer, maybe 5 nanometer range anytime soon. So we need to just get better at using this outdated 7 nanometer node. So that I thought was quite interesting and a testament to the effectiveness of the US export control regime, at least for now.
And to our last section, just a couple more stories before we're done. The first one is from the New York Times. It is that it's titled, "It looked like a reliable news site, but it was an AI chop shop," and provides a pretty detailed example of this new, I suppose, pattern of websites that look like they have news and journalism, but are essentially just AI generated and regurgitating a lot of stuff. A specific example of a news article that was linked from MSN.com had an image of someone who wasn't related to the story, but because the image was there, they implied that the Irish broadcaster in the image was responsible for sexual misconduct. And we don't need to get into more detail, but essentially, we're seeing more of this going on with these websites that just are trying to get you to click. And that's just yet another example of how people who want to make some bucks with AI are just kind of polluting the web with AI-generated stuff.
Yeah, pour one out for the lawyers who are going to have to figure out who owns the libel responsibility for this. Like, if you go out and say, like, hey, so-and-so was charged for sexual misconduct or whatever, and it comes from, you know, some rig that you've set, like, if it's your own algorithm, fine, it kind of makes sense. But, you know, if there's a publisher and separately there's the AI generated content creator, you know, whether that's OpenAI or whoever, you know, how do you figure that out? How much responsibility do you have in crafting the right prompt? Versus, like, let's say, you know, if any way that you prompt ChatGPT and you ask them, like, hey, what's going on with Jeremy Harris? You know, what kind of guy is he? And it just keeps telling you that he's like a very bad plumber. Then, you know, then maybe I within my rights to, like, sue OpenAI. But if you have to actually explicitly prompt it to be like, hey, tell me Jeremy Harris is a really bad plumber, then maybe you own most of the responsibility. But there's this, like, really interesting, fuzzy gray area between these two things that, we do not know how to solve.
Next up, Adobe overhauls terms of service to say it won't train on customers' work. So nowadays, Adobe has cloud-based tooling, and so a lot of what you upload, like photographs, are stored on their servers. And there was a big uproar on Twitter and elsewhere when it was pointed out that the terms of service technically allowed Adobe to train on your data, on the stuff you just use to edit something in Photoshop. And the, I guess, pushback was so significant that Adobe is pushing out these new terms of service by June 18th, so we should already be out to appease the creative community. So yeah, it's just goes to show, like, if you are a creative person, if you're working in this industry, you are very much aware of the notion that your data, your creations can be used for AI training, and you probably don't want that.
Yeah, and I think this really hits Adobe where it hurts, right? Because they've made such a big deal out of, the whole Firefly AI model, saying, hey, look, we only train on things that we have the license for. We will indemnify you, right? They were the first company to say that. If you get sued in court, like, we will come in and protect you if you get sued for using the images that we generate. So really trying to make this whole idea of, like, clear legal grounds for using their products in a clean way, very much their differentiator. That, would seem to be consistent with also upholding the rights of the users as well. And so, this sort of thing is, it's a bigger challenge for them than it would be for another company. But they're making the modifications, and they'll take the L for today and maybe come out with a stronger user agreement.
And the last story, Buzzy AI search engine Perplexity is directly ripping off content from news outlets. So we covered recently how they launched this new feature, Perplexity Pages, which instead of showing you search results, sort of has a Wikipedia style or other style article or website look on whatever topic you want. And what this article goes into is how it seems like some of the pages generated are kind of regurgitating from other sources. So for instance, Perplexity, a page on a self-drone project kind of just uses information from Forbes and takes those articles, and while there is attribution, it's pretty small, and there are links to the original sources, but it's easy to miss. So another example, I think the New York Times suit against OpenAI was essentially claiming that ChatGPT regurgitated entire articles from the New York Times. This is a little less bad because there is at least attribution, but clearly still not ideal for Perplexity.
Yeah, it's sort of same category as the Adobe story we just talked about, right? Like, if you're, or roughly, never piss off journalists in this particular case, right? They're the ones with the audience and the reach. So kind of funny because in this Forbes piece they talk about how specifically, Forbes exclusive reporting on Eric Schmidt's stealth drone project contains several fragments that appear to have been lifted, including a custom illustration. So this is pretty brazen stuff. So anyway, Forbes is understandably pissed about that piece and broadcasting it for all the world to see.
Yeah, and I feel like it's only a matter of time until all websites just restrict the bot access without a paid API. I've already seen this happen with websites like VentureBeat. Nowadays, you can't just query it via a simple script. It used to be, so it's coming to the entire internet.
And then you got to ask yourself, websites that don't have that, right, implicitly, either they don't care about it or are not tracking the issue, but increasingly you got to start to wonder, okay, well, why do they want this data to be included in the training data or served up or whatever? You may have adversarial attack possibilities there too. So yeah, kind of interesting what that'll tell us about, anyway, websites and their content.
And with that, we are done with another episode of Last Week in AI. As always, you can go to the text newsletter at lastweekin.ai. You can get all the links to what we discussed in the description, also our emails and social handles. And we do appreciate your reviews and your feedback and your comments on YouTube, so feel free to do that. But more than anything, do be sure to keep tuning in and enjoy this AI-generated song.
Stay tuned, get clued, it's true. We brought the latest from the AI crew. From Apple's brain to dreams unconfined. Say superintelligence, we've got aligned. Tech cutting edge and Apple's latest view. Dream machines and minds, a future redesigned. Say superintelligence, let no fear be enshrined.